By late July in 1931, somewhere along the North Carolina coast, Hattie Bloom had already walked the same stretch of weathered boardwalk for 3 summers running. Visitors from Raleigh and Durham knew her bell before they saw her. A bright 2-note ding that cut clean through salt wind and the low rhythmic crash of surf under the pier. She sold peppermint sticks from a painted wooden tray she carried on a leather shoulder strap, the kind with brass rivets that caught sunlight when she turned. She kept her change purse clipped to her belt with a spring clasp because children liked to grab at the coins when she bent down to hand them candy wrapped in wax paper. The old men in North Carolina still say she was the kind of woman who never missed a shift, never turned surly when the crowds thinned out after the first week of August, never complained when fog rolled in thick enough to taste like cold metal on the back of your tongue. Hattie was 41 that summer. She had a sister named Ida, who worked as a seamstress in a rooming house on Oleander Street, half a mile inland from the boardwalk. The two of them had come down from Virginia after their father died in 1928, looking for work that didn't involve a factory floor or a tobacco sorting line. Hattie found the candy-selling job through a church bulletin, and she took to it the way some people take to a place they've been looking for without knowing it. She liked the rhythm of the boardwalk, the creak of old wood under her boots, the gull cries, the way families smiled when she rang her bell. She liked the work enough to stay 3 years, which was longer than most vendors lasted on a pier that smelled like tar and rotting kelp even on the best days. The boardwalk itself sat low and crooked, built 40 years earlier by a lumber concern out of Wilmington that went belly up before the coast highway ever came through. By 1931, it was mostly salt-rotted pilings and warped planks held together by tar patches and blind hope. The pier stretched 200 feet past the tide line, and underneath it, the sand stayed damp and cold even at high noon in July. Barnacles crusted the cross-bracing so thick you couldn't see the wood underneath. Kelp piled in dark, slick mounds against every piling, and the smell of it, sharp and mineral and faintly sweet, never quite left your clothes if you spent any time down there. Hattie kept her extra stock stacked just under the western end of the pier, 4 wooden crates packed with wax paper rolls of peppermint sticks and lemon drops. She'd done it that way since her first season. The damp never touched the candy if you kept the lids nailed tight. Nobody thought twice about her setup. It made sense. It was practical. On the evening of July 29th, she was working late because a church group had come down from Raleigh on the 4 o'clock train and wanted sweets for the children before supper. Folks who were there that night remembered seeing her near the south rail of the pier just after 7, tray mostly empty, bell still ringing clear and bright every time she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. The fog had started coming in around 6:30, the kind that didn't blow through, the kind that sat heavy and wet and made lantern light look like it was bleeding into the air. Hattie told the last customer, a woman with 2 children hanging off her skirt, that she'd be right back. She just needed to fetch another crate from under the pier. She handed the woman her tray to hold. The woman remembered Hattie's hands were warm when they touched. She remembered Hattie smiling, quick and easy, the way she always did. Hattie walked to the south ladder, the one that went straight down to the sand underneath the pier, and she climbed down out of sight. The woman with the tray waited, counting the coins Hattie had left in the little tin cup clipped to the side. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The fog got thicker. The woman called Hattie's name once, soft, then louder. Nobody answered. She handed the tray to her husband and told him to fetch the pier watchman. The watchman's name was Orrin Tate. He was 62 that summer, a man who'd worked every single shift on that pier since before Hattie Bloom was born, back when the boardwalk still had a dance pavilion and electric lights strung on wire between the posts. Orrin knew every plank that sagged, every crossbeam that needed replacing, every place the kelp collected worst after a storm. He went down the south ladder with a kerosene lamp in one hand, and his voice already hoarse from calling her name into the wet air. The sand under the pier was packed slick from the high tide that morning, dark and firm under his boots. The kelp lay heavy across the lower bracing, slick enough to make the wood look black. The smell down there was thick, salt and rot and something else, something faintly metallic that he couldn't place. Orrin could see Hattie's crates stacked neat against the 3rd piling from shore, all 4 of them exactly where they'd been that morning, lids still nailed shut. He could see the shape the fog made when it pressed between the pilings like wet wool. He could not see Hattie Bloom. What he did see, laid flat on top of a bed of kelp-soaked planks near the third piling, was her change purse. It was unclipped from her belt. The spring clasp was still fastened. The leather was bone dry. When Oren picked it up barehanded, the purse was warm. Not just warm, but warm the way a thing gets when it's been held in someone's hand for a long time. Warm like body heat. Warm like life. He called for her again, voice cracking now, lamp swinging wild enough to throw shadows that looked like they were moving on their own across the barnacle-thick wood. Nobody answered. The surf pulled and pushed against the pilings with a low, hollow knock. Oren climbed back up the ladder, legs shaking, and told the woman with the tray to fetch Mr. Keener, the pier boss, and to do it fast. Mr. Keener arrived within 20 minutes, bringing 4 other men and 2 more lamps. By the time they gathered at the top of the south ladder, the bell had started. They all heard it, every single one of them. A thin, bright ding-ding coming from somewhere under the pier, the same 2-note sound Hattie's bell made when she walked the boardwalk. Oren swore it was coming from near the third piling. One of the younger men, a dockhand named Peter Voss, said no. It sounded like it was coming from farther out, past where the kelp stopped and the open sand started. They stood on the pier in the thickening fog with their lamps held low over the rail, listening. The bell rang once more. Then again. Then again. 13 times total, slow and deliberate. Each strike as clean and bright as churchyard bronze. When it stopped, nobody said a word for a long time. The surf kept knocking against the pilings. The fog pressed in tighter. Mr. Keener sent 2 men down the south ladder and 2 down the north, 1 at each end of the pier. They swept the sand underneath with lamplight, calling Hattie's name until their throats went raw and their voices started to crack. They found her crates, still stacked, still sealed. They found driftwood smoothed white by seawater. They found bottle glass and fish bones and 1 split oar wedged tight between 2 pilings. They did not find Hattie Bloom. They did not find her bell. Oren Tate stayed on the sand longer than the others. He walked slow along the wet stretch near the third piling, lamp held chest-high, eyes on the ground. The sand there was smooth, packed firm by the morning tide, marked only by gull tracks, and the long drag lines kelp made when the water pulled it back and forth. That's when he saw the boot prints. They started just past where the dry sand ended, maybe 5 feet from the base of the third piling. They were Hattie's. Oren knew the shape of her work boots, narrow at the heel, worn smooth on the outer edge from the way she walked. But the prints were facing the wrong way. They came in backward, heel first, 1 careful step after another, moving in a slow, deliberate circle around the third piling. The circle closed. The prints stopped at the edge of open water where the tide was already pulling back out to sea. There were no prints leading away. There were no prints leading in from anywhere else. Just that 1 backward circle, heel to toe, ending at nothing. Oren stood there with the lamp shaking so hard in his hand that the light jumped across the sand like something alive. He did not call the other men down to look. He did not mark the spot. He climbed back up the ladder, joints stiff, throat tight, and told Keener in a voice barely louder than the surf that they needed to close the pier and keep it closed. By midnight, the whole stretch of coastline knew Hattie Bloom was gone. Her sister Ida came down from the rooming house on Oleander Street and sat on a wooden bench near the shuttered ticket kiosk, hands folded tight in her lap, shawl pulled close around her shoulders even though the air was still warm. She didn't cry. She just sat there waiting, the way people wait when they don't know what else to do. Men from the church group and the local fishing docks searched the beach north and south for 2 miles in both directions, their lamps making a long, broken line of light along the surf. They brought dogs, 3 hounds that had pulled drowned men out of river mud before. The dogs pulled hard toward the water's edge, noses low, and then stopped dead. They whined. They lay down in the sand. They refused to go past the tide line no matter how hard their handlers tugged the leads. The note turned up 6 hours after Hattie disappeared. One of the search party, a clerk from the hardware store named Howard Finch, had gone to check the locked ticket kiosk where Hattie sometimes stored empty crates when the weather turned bad. The kiosk sat at the landward end of the pier, a narrow box made of painted wood with shutters that folded down over the window. It had a Yale padlock on the door that only Mr. Keener carried the key for. and Keener swore on his mother's grave he hadn't opened that door in 3 days. When Finch peered through the narrow gap in the shutters with his lamp pressed close to the wood, he saw a folded piece of paper sitting square in the middle of the counter inside, white and clean, no dust on it at all. Keener came down with the key, hands shaking so hard it took him 3 tries to fit it in the lock. The door swung open. The paper was there, just as Finch had said, folded once, edges crisp, bone dry. Keener opened it slow, like he was afraid it might fall apart in his hands. The handwriting inside was neat, small, steady, written in pencil. It said, "Check the bracing under 3. When they showed the note to Ida Bloom, she stared at it for a long time without touching it. Then she said, quiet, that it looked like Hattie's hand. She said Hattie always wrote her 3s with a little loop at the top, just like that. She said Hattie had been under that pier over an hour before the note was found, and there was no earthly way she could have written it. Walked to a locked kiosk she didn't have a key for, placed it on the counter inside and locked the door behind her without anyone seeing. Mr. Keener closed the pier at dusk that night. He closed it at dusk the next night and the night after that, and every night for the next 30 years. By the second week of August 1931, the new rule was known up and down the Carolina coast from Wilmington to Morehead City. The pier shut down when the light started to go, no exceptions, no lingering, no late swimmers, no evening fishermen. People in North Carolina still don't ask why out loud, but the old-timers will tell you if you're new to the area and don't know any better. If you hear a vendor's bell ringing after the sun goes down anywhere near that stretch of beach, you don't stop walking. You don't turn around. You don't answer back. The search began in earnest at first light on July 30th. Less than 12 hours after Hattie Bloom climbed down the south ladder and didn't come back up. By 6 in the morning, 23 men had gathered at the pier entrance. Dock workers, fishermen, shopkeepers from the 2-block stretch of storefronts that made up the town's commercial district, and 3 members of the volunteer fire brigade who brought rope and grappling hooks. Mr. Keener stood at the front with a clipboard, writing down names, assigning sections. Orrin Tate stood off to the side, not talking, his face gray in the early light. He hadn't slept. Nobody who'd been under that pier the night before had slept much. They divided the search into grids. 4 men took the beach north of the pier, walking shoulder to shoulder in a straight line from the dune grass down to the surf. 4 more took the beach south, doing the same. 6 men went under the pier itself with lamps and long poles to probe the kelp beds and check the spaces between pilings where a body might have gotten wedged by the tide. The rest spread out along the boardwalk and the scrub pine thickets that bordered the inland side of the coast road, looking for any sign she might have walked away from the pier on her own and gotten lost or hurt in the fog. They found nothing. By 9 o'clock, the sun had burned off most of the morning haze and the air smelled like hot wood and salt. The men under the pier came back up one by one, boots caked in wet sand, faces tight. One of them, a fisherman named Carl Drucker, said he'd checked every inch of sand within 50 feet of the 3rd piling and found nothing but her boot prints, the backward circle Orrin had seen the night before, still clear in the packed sand, heel first, ending at open water. Another man, younger, said he'd run his hands along every piece of bracing under the 3rd piling, looking for anything that matched the note's instruction to check the bracing under 3. He found barnacles. He found splinters. He found one rusted nail driven crooked into the wood. He did not find Hattie Bloom, and he did not find anything that looked like a message or a clue. The timeline they pieced together that morning made no sense. Hattie had been seen on the pier at 7 o'clock, handing her tray to the woman with 2 children. 3 witnesses confirmed it. She'd told the woman she'd be right back. Her exact words, according to the woman, were, "Just need to grab one more crate, won't be a minute." The woman estimated Hattie had been gone no more than 5 minutes before she sent her husband to find Orrin Tate. Orrin reached the south ladder within 2 minutes of being called. He was under the pier, lamp in hand, within another minute after that. That meant Hattie Bloom had been under the pier alone, for no more than 7 or 8 minutes total before Orrin came looking. In those 7 or 8 minutes, she had climbed down the ladder, walked to the 3rd piling, unclipped her change purse and set it down on dry, kelp-soaked planks, walked a slow backward circle around the piling in the wet sand, and vanished into open water without leaving a single forward-facing boot print. without making a sound loud enough to be heard above the surf, and without disturbing her stacked crates or leaving any sign of struggle. And at some point during or after those same 7 or 8 minutes, her bell had rung 13 times from somewhere under the pier, clear and deliberate, even though Oren swore he never saw the bell itself, and none of the men who came down later ever found it. "It doesn't make sense," Carl Drucker said that morning, sitting on the edge of the pier with his boots hanging over the side. "You can't walk backward in wet sand that clean. You'd slip. You'd stagger. The prints would smear." "They didn't smear," Oren said, quiet. "I know they didn't," Carl said. "That's what I'm saying." By midday, Ida Bloom had come back to the pier with a photograph of her sister, a small tintype portrait taken 2 years earlier at a church social. The men passed it around. Most of them already knew what Hattie looked like. She'd worked that boardwalk for 3 summers after all. But Ida wanted them to see her face again, wanted them to remember she was a real woman with a real life, not just a name on Mr. Keener's clipboard. The photograph showed Hattie standing stiff and formal in a dark dress, hands folded, eyes serious but not unkind. Ida kept her voice steady when she spoke. She said Hattie had no enemies. She said Hattie didn't owe anyone money. She said Hattie didn't have a sweetheart or a rival or any kind of trouble that would make her run off or put herself in danger. She said her sister was the steadiest person she'd ever known. "She wouldn't just leave," Ida said. "Not without her purse, not without telling me." One of the younger men asked, "Careful if Hattie knew how to swim." Ida looked at him for a long moment. "She grew up near the James River," she said. "She could swim fine, but she wouldn't have gone in the water at night in her work boots and apron. Not on purpose." The search continued. Men tied strips of white cloth to the fence posts along the coast road to mark how far they'd walked. They dragged grappling hooks through the shallow water on both sides of the pier, pulling up kelp and driftwood and one waterlogged boot that didn't belong to Hattie. They borrowed 2 rowboats from the fishing docks and rowed slow circles around the pier pilings, looking down into the murky water for any shape that didn't belong. They found nothing. By late afternoon, the dogs were brought back, the same 3 hounds that had refused to go past the tide line the night before. This time the handlers tried a different approach, starting the dogs at Hattie's rooming house on Oleander Street with a scarf she'd left on her bed. The hounds picked up the scent and followed it in a straight line down to the boardwalk, up onto the pier, and directly to the south ladder. Then they stopped. They whined. They lay down flat on the planks and would not move, no matter how hard the handlers pulled. That evening, just before sunset, something happened that nobody could explain. Peter Voss, the young dockhand who'd heard the bell the night before, was walking the north section of beach alone, eyes on the sand, looking for anything the earlier search parties might have missed. He'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when he heard it, a soft 2-note sound, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere behind him. He turned fast, heart pounding. There was nothing there, just empty beach and the long shadow the pier made across the sand. He stood still, listening. The sound came again, clearer this time. Ding, 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 ding. It was coming from under the pier, from the direction of the 3rd piling. Peter ran. He reached the south ladder, climbed down, lamp swinging from his belt. The sand under the pier was empty. The kelp lay still. Hattie's crate sat undisturbed. He called out, voice shaking, asking if anyone was there. Nobody answered. The bell did not ring again. When he climbed back up and told the others what he'd heard, 2 men went down with him to check. They found nothing. But all 3 of them agreed on one thing. The air under the pier, near the 3rd piling, smelled faintly of peppermint. By the 3rd day, the older men in North Carolina, the ones who'd lived on that stretch of coast their whole lives, who remembered storms that took houses and tides that moved shorelines, started talking in low voices about rules. Nobody used the word haunted. Nobody said ghost or spirit or anything like it. But the rules started forming anyway, quiet and firm, the way rules do when a community decides it's safer to follow them than to ask why they exist. Don't go under the pier alone after dark. Don't answer if you hear a bell ringing when no one's there. If the dogs won't go past a certain point, you don't go past it either. If you smell peppermint where there's no reason for peppermint, you turn around and walk away. Mr. Keener made the dusk closure official on August 2nd, 4 days after Hattie disappeared. He posted a hand-painted sign at the pier entrance, closed sunset to sunrise by order of management. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. Everyone who worked the boardwalk already knew. The vendors packed up earlier. The fishermen stopped tying their boats to the pier pilings overnight. Families with children left the beach before the light started to go, even on clear evenings when the fog stayed out at sea. On the 5th day, a boy found Hattie's bell. He was 9 years old, the son of one of the search party men, and he'd been told a dozen times not to go near the pier. But boys that age don't always listen, and he'd gone down to the sand early in the morning to look for shells before anyone else was awake. He found the bell half buried in dry sand 20 feet north of the pier, well above the tide line, lying on its side with the clapper still inside. It was clean, no rust, no kelp, no salt crust. The metal was warm when he picked it up. He brought it to his father, who brought it to Mr. Keener, who brought it to Ida Bloom. She held it in both hands and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she asked, quiet, how a bell that had been ringing under the pier 5 nights earlier could end up buried in dry sand 20 feet away without anyone seeing it get there. Nobody had an answer. Keener put the bell in a wooden box and stored it in the locked kiosk, the same place the note had appeared. He didn't like keeping it, but he didn't know what else to do. Ida didn't want it. She said it didn't feel right. That night, 3 men camping on the beach a quarter-mile south of the pier reported hearing a faint ding-ding sound just after midnight. They said it seemed to come from the direction of the old boardwalk, but when they looked, they couldn't see any lights or movement. They packed up their camp and left before dawn. One of them told the pier boss the next morning, voice low, that he'd been camping that beach for 15 years and never once felt the need to leave in the middle of the night. He said he wouldn't be coming back. By the end of the first week, the search parties had stopped. There was nowhere left to walk that didn't already hold their boot prints, and still, nobody had found Hattie Bloom. Orrin Tate kept working his shifts, but he wouldn't go down the south ladder anymore, not even in full daylight. When the younger workers asked him why, he just shook his head and said, "You don't need to know why. You just need to stay off that sand after the sun starts to drop." People in North Carolina still remember that first week. They remember the way the rules formed without anyone writing them down, the way the older hands taught the younger ones to recognize when a place stops feeling right. They remember the bell in the box, warm to the touch, ringing sometimes in the night when no hand was near it. And they remember the backward boot prints in the sand, circling once, stopping at water, leading nowhere at all. By the second week of August, the search for Hattie Bloom had stopped being a search and started being something else. A ritual, maybe, or a vigil, or just a thing people did because not doing it felt worse. Every morning at dawn, a handful of men still walked the beach in both directions, eyes on the sand looking for something they couldn't name. Every evening before the pier closed, someone, usually Orrin Tate or one of the older dock hands, walked the length of the boardwalk one last time, checking the rails, the planks, the shadows under the ticket kiosk. Nobody talked about what they were looking for anymore. Nobody needed to. Ida Bloom came to the pier every day for the first 10 days. She sat on the same bench near the kiosk, hands folded in her lap, watching the water. Women from the church brought her soup and bread wrapped in cloth, and she ate because they stood there waiting until she did. On the 11th day, she stopped coming. A neighbor said she'd gone to stay with an aunt in Raleigh, that she couldn't bear to look at the ocean anymore. Mr. Keener kept Hattie's painted wooden tray in his office, propped against the wall where he could see it. He never said why. He didn't need to. The pier itself had started to feel different. The vendors who still worked the boardwalk, 2 men selling fried fish and a woman selling lemonade from a painted cart, all said the same thing. The air near the south end felt heavier now, thicker, like it took more effort to breathe when you got close to the south ladder. Customers noticed it too. Families with children stopped walking past the midpoint of the pier. Fishermen who used to set up their lines near the far rail moved closer to shore. Nobody gave a reason. Nobody needed to. The pier was 200 feet long, but by mid-August, people only used the first 100. On August 12th, 14 days after Hattie disappeared, a carpenter named Raymond Lisk went down under the pier to check the structural bracing. Mr. Keener had hired him to inspect the pilings and crossbeams, looking for rot or weakness that might need repair before the autumn storms came through. Raymond was 56, steady-handed, the kind of man who didn't spook easy. He'd built half the docks between Wilmington and Morehead City. He went down the south ladder just after 8 in the morning with a toolbox, a kerosene lamp, and a measuring tape. He was down there for maybe 20 minutes before he called for help. His voice came up through the planks, tight and strange. 2 men ran to the ladder, Peter Voss and a dockhand named Frank Collier. They found Raymond standing near the 3rd piling, lamp held high, staring at the bracing that ran horizontal between the piling and the next support beam. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. "Look at this," he said, and pointed. Carved into the bracing about chest height were 2 letters, HB. The carving was fresh. The cuts were clean, sharp-edged, pale against the dark, salt-weathered wood. Sawdust still clung to the edges of the letters, fine and golden, the kind of dust you get when you carve into wood that hasn't been touched in years. Raymond ran his finger along one of the cuts. The wood inside was dry, slightly warm, like it had been worked recently. "This wasn't here before," Raymond said, voice low. "I checked this exact beam on the 5th day. I ran my hands over every inch of it. There was nothing." Peter Voss stared at the initials. "You sure?" "I'm sure," Raymond said. He turned to look at them and his face was tight. "I've been doing this work for 30 years. I know when a carving is fresh. This was done in the last day or 2, maybe less." Frank Collier reached out, slow, and touched the letters with his fingertips. He pulled his hand back fast. "It's warm," he said. They stood there under the pier, the 3 of them, not talking. The surf knocked against the pilings with a low, rhythmic thud. The smell of peppermint drifted through the air, faint but distinct, even though there was no candy anywhere near them. Finally, Raymond picked up his toolbox and climbed back up the ladder. He told Mr. Keener he was done with the inspection, that the pier was sound enough, that he wouldn't be coming back. When Keener asked why, Raymond just shook his head and said some jobs aren't worth the money. Word of the carving spread fast. By that afternoon, half the town knew. Some people said it proved Hattie had been down there recently, that maybe she was still alive somewhere, hiding or hurt or too scared to come back. Others said it proved the opposite, that whatever had taken her was still there, still under the pier, still leaving signs. A few people, the older ones, didn't offer theories. They just said it was time to stop asking questions and start following the rules that were forming whether anyone liked them or not. Ida Bloom came back from Raleigh when she heard. She asked to see the carving. Mr. Keener took her down the south ladder himself, holding a lamp, walking slow. She stood in front of the bracing for a long time, not touching it, just looking. The initials were neat, careful, carved with the same precision Hattie used when she wrote her name in the ledger every morning to mark her shift. Ida didn't cry. She just stared, and then she said, "Quiet." That's how she made her H, the crossbar high, not in the middle. Keener asked if she thought Hattie had carved it. Ida shook her head. Hattie didn't carry a knife. She didn't like them. She wouldn't have carved anything. Then who did? Keener asked. Ida didn't answer. She climbed back up the ladder and walked off the pier and didn't come back again. That night the bell rang. 3 people heard it. A night watchman making his rounds along the coast road, a fisherman checking his nets at the north dock, and a woman closing up the lemonade cart near the pier entrance. They all described it the same way, a clear, bright ding-ding, the 2-note sound Hattie's bell used to make, coming from somewhere under the pier. The sound repeated 3 times, slow and deliberate, and then stopped. The night watchman walked to the pier entrance with his lantern and called out, asking if anyone was there. Nobody answered. He didn't go down the ladder. He said later, when people asked, that the air near the south end felt wrong, felt like it was pushing back against him, and he'd learned a long time ago not to push back when a place told you to leave. The bell in the wooden box, the one the boy had found buried in the sand, the one Mr. Keener had locked in the kiosk, was still there the next morning untouched. But when Keener opened the box to check, the bell was lying on its side instead of sitting upright the way he'd left it. And it was warm. Not just warm, hot enough that he dropped it and had to wrap it in a rag to pick it up again. By the third week of August, people had stopped trying to explain what had happened to Hattie Bloom. The theories had narrowed down to 3, and nobody said them out loud, but everyone knew what they were. The first theory was human. Maybe someone had taken her. Maybe she'd had an enemy after all, someone Ida didn't know about. Someone who'd followed her under the pier and done something terrible and hidden the body where it wouldn't be found. Maybe the bell and the boot prints and the carved initials were all part of some elaborate trick, some cruel game meant to confuse the search and cover up a crime. The second theory was natural. Maybe she'd slipped on the kelp, hit her head, fallen into the water during a surge they hadn't noticed. Maybe the tide had pulled her out to sea before anyone could reach her. Maybe the carved initials were a coincidence, something left by a drifter or a bored fisherman years ago that nobody had noticed until now. Maybe the bell had washed up on shore and gotten buried by wind and sand, and the warmth people kept feeling was just sun-heated metal or the heat of their own hands. The third theory was the one nobody in North Carolina dared to say out loud. Not then, and not now. It was the theory that said Hattie Bloom had walked down that ladder on a fog-thick evening and met something under the pier that didn't follow the rules of the world the rest of them lived in. Something that could make a bell ring without hands to shake it. Something that could carve initials into weathered wood without a blade anyone could see. Something that could pull a woman into the water backward, heel first, without leaving a single sign of struggle or a single forward-facing footprint. Something that could reach through time and space and leave a change purse warm with body heat on kelp-soaked planks in a place where no living person stood. The older men in North Carolina, the ones who'd worked the coast long enough to know that some things don't have explanations that fit into daylight conversations, started teaching the younger ones a new set of rules. You don't work under the pier alone. You don't go down the south ladder after the sun starts to drop. If you hear a bell ringing and you can't see who's ringing it, you walk the other way. If you smell peppermint where there's no reason for peppermint, you don't investigate. You leave. You don't argue. You don't ask why. You just follow the rule, and you stay alive. By the end of August, those rules were as solid as the planks under their feet. On the last day of the month, a boy walking the beach at low tide found a second change purse half buried in the sand near the base of the third piling. It was identical to Hattie's. Same leather, same brass clasp, same stitching along the edge. It was bone dry. It was empty. And when the boy picked it up, his hands shaking, the leather was still warm. He brought it to his father. His father brought it to Mr. Keener. Keener opened the first purse, the one Orrin had found on the kelp-soaked planks the night Hattie disappeared, and laid both purses side by side on his desk. They were identical. Same wear pattern on the strap, same small scuff mark near the clasp, same faint smell of peppermint leather. Keener locked them both in the kiosk with the bell and didn't speak about them again. But that night, he went home and told his wife they were leaving North Carolina before the autumn came. He said he'd worked that pier for 18 years and never once felt afraid of it. But he was afraid now. He said some places stopped being safe when they stopped making sense, and the pier had stopped making sense the night Hattie Bloom climbed down the south ladder and didn't come back up. They left in September. Orrin Tate took over as pier boss, but he ran it different. He locked the south ladder with a chain and padlock every evening at dusk. He hired 2 men for every shift instead of 1. He told every vendor, every fisherman, every worker who set foot on that boardwalk the same thing. The pier closes at sunset, no exceptions. And if you hear anything strange, a bell, a voice, footsteps on wet sand, you don't go looking. You come find him, and he'll decide what to do. Nobody argued. Nobody asked why. The rules had settled in deep by then, and the people who lived and worked along that stretch of North Carolina coast knew better than to break them. The pier stayed open through the autumn of 1931, but it was a different place than it had been before late July. The dusk closure became permanent. The south ladder stayed chained and padlocked. The vendors who came back for the fall season, fewer than half the number from the summer, all set up their carts and tables on the north half of the boardwalk, as far from the third piling as the pier allowed. Orrin Tate hired a second watchman to work the overnight shifts with him, a man named Douglas Farrow, who'd worked lighthouses up and down the Carolina coast. and didn't ask too many questions. The two of them walked the pier together every night after sunset, checking the locks, checking the shadows, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. Some nights they heard nothing. Some nights they heard the bell. It was always the same. A faint ding-ding coming from under the pier, from the direction of the third piling, always after dark, always when the fog was thick. Orrin and Douglas never went down to check. They'd learned by then that some things you don't investigate. You just mark them down in the logbook and make sure the locks hold. The bell in the wooden box, locked in the kiosk with the two identical change purses, rang sometimes too. Not every night. Maybe once a week. Maybe less. But when it did, both men could hear it clear as churchyard bronze even through the locked door in the wooden walls. Neither of them ever opened the box to check. Neither of them wanted to know if the bell was still sitting where they'd left it, or if it had moved on its own. By the winter of 1931, Hattie Bloom's name had stopped appearing in the local newspaper. The search was over. The case was filed away as an unsolved disappearance, cause unknown, body never recovered. Ida Bloom stayed in Raleigh and never came back to the coast. She wrote one letter to Orrin Tate in December, asking if there had been any new developments, any signs, anything at all. Orrin wrote back and said no, there hadn't been, and he was sorry. He didn't mention the bell ringing in the locked kiosk. He didn't mention the faint smell of peppermint that drifted across the pier on foggy nights. He didn't think it would help her to know. The pier limped through the next few years. Fewer tourists came. The vendors who did come didn't stay long. By 1934, the boardwalk was half empty most days, and the businesses that had relied on summer crowds started closing one by one. The lemonade cart disappeared. The fried fish stand shut down. The ticket kiosk stopped selling tickets because there was nothing left to sell tickets for. In 1936, a hurricane came through and tore off a 30-foot section of the pier's north end, and the town council voted not to repair it. The cost was too high, they said. The revenue wasn't there anymore. But the older members of the council, the ones who'd lived through the summer of 1931, knew the real reason. The pier had stopped feeling safe. It had stopped feeling like a place people wanted to be. Orrin Tate kept working until 1938. By then he was 69, too old to be climbing ladders and hauling rope, too tired to keep walking the boards every night, waiting for sounds he didn't want to hear. He handed the keys over to Douglas Farrow and moved inland to live with his daughter in Durham. He never went back to the coast. When people asked him why, he'd just shake his head and say some places wear you down in ways you can't see. And the pier had worn him down to nothing. Douglas Farrow ran the pier for another 6 years, but he ran it like a man guarding a wound. He kept the south ladder chained. He kept the kiosk locked. He never worked a shift alone, not once, not even in broad daylight. He hired young men from inland towns, men who didn't know the story, and he taught them the rules on their first day. 2 men per shift, never one. Pier closes at dusk, no exceptions. If you hear a bell ringing and you can't see who's ringing it, you walk away. Most of them followed the rules. A few didn't. The ones who didn't never lasted more than a week. In 1942, a new dock hand named Martin Shea went down the south ladder on a dare. It was mid-afternoon, full sun, no fog. The other workers told him not to. Douglas told him not to. Martin laughed and said he didn't believe in ghost stories, and he climbed down with a flashlight and a cigarette hanging from his mouth. He was down there for less than 5 minutes. When he came back up, his face was gray and his hands were shaking so hard he couldn't light another cigarette. He quit that same day. When the other men asked what he'd seen, he wouldn't say. He just kept repeating over and over. It was warm. It shouldn't have been warm. Nobody asked what he meant. Nobody wanted to know. The pier finally closed for good in 1944. The town council voted to condemn it, citing structural damage and safety concerns. They sent a crew to board up the entrances and post warning signs along the beach. The crew worked fast, finishing in less than a day, and none of them went near the south end. The boardwalk sat empty after that, weathering slowly under salt wind and summer storms, the planks turning gray, the pilings sagging, the whole structure sinking inch by inch into the sand. But the rules stayed. People in North Carolina, especially the older families, the ones who'd lived on that stretch of coast since before the pier was built, still taught their children not to go near the old boardwalk after dark. They still told them not to answer if they heard a bell ringing on foggy nights. They still warned them that some places hold on to things, that some disappearances don't close clean, that the ocean gives back what it takes, except when it doesn't. In 1953, a developer from Raleigh bought the land where the pier had stood and tried to build a new structure, a modern fishing dock with concrete pilings and electric lights. The construction crew started work in April. By May, 3 workers had quit. One said he kept smelling peppermint where there was no source for it. Another said he heard footsteps on wet sand under the new pilings, but when he went to check, there were no prints. The third worker said he found a change purse half buried near the site of the old third piling, leather still warm, and he wasn't going to stick around to find out why. The developer abandoned the project in June. The land sat empty after that. It still sits empty now. In 1967, a historian from the State University came to the coast to research unsolved disappearances from the early 20th century. She interviewed 12 people who'd been alive in 1931, including Douglas Farrow and 2 of the original search party members. They all told the same story. The backward boot prints, the warm change purse, the bell ringing 13 times, the carved initials appearing on bracing that had been inspected days before. The historian wrote it all down, and then she asked the question every outsider asks. What do you think really happened to Hattie Bloom? Douglas Farrow looked at her for a long time before answering. Finally, he said, I think she went down that ladder and met something that doesn't fit into the kind of report you're trying to write. And I think it's still there. The historian published her findings in a journal article in 1969. She listed 3 possible explanations: foul play by an unknown assailant, accidental drowning with the body carried out to sea, or mass hysteria and coincidence creating a false narrative around a simple tragedy. She did not include a 4th explanation. But in her private notes found after her death in 1998, she wrote, I have reviewed every detail of this case a dozen times. I cannot explain the warm objects. I cannot explain the backward prints. I cannot explain the carved initials appearing after the search. I cannot explain the bell. I choose not to include what I cannot explain, because including it would require me to accept that some things happen outside the framework we use to understand the world. I am not ready to accept that, but the people who live in North Carolina, the ones who grew up hearing the story passed down from parents and grandparents, the ones who know better than to walk certain beaches after dark, they've already accepted it. They've accepted that on a fog-thick evening in July of 1931, Hattie Bloom climbed down a ladder to fetch a crate of peppermint sticks and walked into something that didn't follow the rules the rest of them live by. They've accepted that her change purse was warm because something had been holding it. They've accepted that her boot prints went backward because she wasn't the one making them. They've accepted that the bell rang 13 times because 13 is the number of steps it takes to walk from the bottom of the south ladder to the third piling, and something wanted them to know it had made that walk. They don't talk about it much, not out loud, not in daylight, but the rules remain, passed quietly from the old to the young, woven so deep into the culture of that coastline that newcomers learn them without ever hearing the full story. Don't work under piers alone. Don't answer bells you can't see. Don't go looking for warmth in places that should be cold. Don't trust footprints that face the wrong way. And if you smell peppermint on a foggy night near an old stretch of beach where a boardwalk used to stand, you turn around and you walk in the opposite direction, and you don't look back. In 2003, a teenager walking the beach at low tide found a small brass bell half buried in the sand, 20 feet from where the third piling used to be. It was clean. It had no rust. When she picked it up, the metal was warm in her hands, warm like something alive, and she dropped it fast and ran, she told her mother. Her mother told her never to go back to that part of the beach. The girl asked why. Her mother said, because some places don't let go, not ever. The bell was gone the next morning. Nobody went looking for it, so which version makes sense here? The one where Hattie Bloom was the victim of a crime that was perfectly hidden? The one where she drowned and the ocean swallowed every trace? Or the one where she stepped under a pier and met something that still walks that sand in circles heel first, leaving warmth where there should only be cold? And if it's the third version, the one nobody in North Carolina dares to say out loud. Then what carved those initials into the bracing days after the search began, and whose hands held that change purse long enough to keep it warm in a place where no living person stood? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.